What if I told you that in the 19th century, long after the pharaohs had turned to dust, tens of thousands of men were once again sweating under the sun to raise giant pyramids? Not in Egypt, but in Europe and America, built for world fairs, exhibitions, and the dreams of powerful elites. Imagine working 12 hours a day, with nothing but bread, onions, and water to keep you alive, while above you nobles sipped champagne, marveling at the very stones you carried. These forgotten workers, call them laborers, dreamers, or prisoners of ambition, lived a life as harsh and secretive as any ancient builder. How did they survive? What hidden techniques did they use? And why do these forgotten, artificial pyramids still haunt our imagination today? Stay with me until the end, because every detail will make you see the 19th century in a way you've never imagined before. And if you love discovering the daily lives of people in the past, give me a like, a subscribe, and share this video so I have the motivation to bring you more untold stories from history. Now, let's step into the secret life of the pyramid builders of the 19th century. 100,000 workers. That's the staggering number often whispered about when people speak of the men behind the artificial pyramids of the 19th century. Of course, the number itself might sound exaggerated. But imagine this. At the height of an industrial exhibition in Paris or Chicago, swarms of laborers flooded the construction sites. Not slaves, like in the ancient tales of Egypt, but men from nearby villages. Poor immigrants desperate for work. Even former soldiers looking for a wage to keep their families alive. When you picture these builders, don't think of nameless shadows. Think of calloused hands gripping ropes, sweat dripping down brows, laughter exchanged in stolen moments of rest. They weren't kings or nobles, just ordinary people asked to perform extraordinary tasks. I sometimes wonder how they felt, looking up at the massive structures they helped raise. Did they feel pride, knowing they were leaving something behind that others would marvel at? Or did they simply feel trapped, like ants building someone else's monument, too tired to think beyond the next day's bread? Personally, I believe it was both, a strange mix of survival and silent dignity. And that's what makes their stories so human. It reminds us that history is not just about great leaders or wealthy patrons. It's about the thousands whose names never made it into the books. And yet, their presence was undeniable. Without these vast armies of workers, the modern pyramids would have remained only dreams on paper. This hidden labor force is where the story begins, because to understand their lives, we must first understand the brutal rhythm of their days. Which brings us to the next part. What did a 12-hour shift under the blazing sun really mean for these forgotten builders? 12 hours beneath the burning sun. That was the daily reality for most pyramid builders of the 19th century. From the moment the first light broke, men were already hauling stone, mixing mortar, and climbing shaky wooden scaffolds. There was no concept of work-life balance. Only the endless rhythm of lifting, pulling, and sweating. Lunch wasn't a break in the way we think of it today. It was a hasty bite of bread, maybe an onion or a boiled potato, eaten with dusty fingers while sitting on blocks of stone that scorched like ovens. Then, without complaint, they would rise again and continue until the sun dipped below the horizon. I try to imagine standing in their shoes, your shirt sticking to your back, your hands raw, your lungs filled with the grit of lime and dust. Did they ever look up at the sky and wonder if the nobles sipping wine nearby even noticed their struggle? To me, this image is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because of the sheer hardship they endured, yet inspiring because despite everything, they carried on. They had families waiting at home, hungry mouths to feed, and perhaps a quiet dream that one day their children wouldn't have to break their backs the same way. And here's something important. These men didn't just build pyramids of stone. They built pyramids of memory. Every bruise, every bead of sweat, every sunburned hour is still imprinted in the very structures that stand. Even if their names have been forgotten, when I think about it, their lives remind us that behind every grand monument lies a story of sacrifice that history books rarely tell. But what did they get in return for such labor? Surely a life of suffering had to be worth at least enough coins to keep them alive. Or did it? That's where the story of their weekly wages begins. 5 coins a week. That was often the going rate for a laborer breaking his back on a 19th century pyramid site. Think about that for a moment. After 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, The reward was barely enough to keep bread on the table. Rent for a tiny, damp room might swallow 2 coins. Food for a family of 4 could easily take the rest. And if a child fell ill, those meager wages dissolved like sand in the wind. I sometimes picture a worker walking home with those coins jingling in his pocket. On the surface, it's payment, but in truth, it's a reminder of how little his sweat was valued. Imagine handing over nearly everything you earned just to keep your children from going hungry, knowing there would be nothing left for yourself. Personally, I can't help but feel both anger and admiration. Anger because society treated these men as expendable. Admiration because they still showed up, day after day, carrying not just stones but the weight of responsibility for their families. And perhaps that is the hidden lesson here. History's greatest monuments were often built on the smallest rewards. These men didn't just sell their labor. They traded away their youth, their health, and sometimes their very lives for a handful of coins. And yet, even in such poverty, they forged a strange kind of pride, the pride of knowing that their work would stand tall long after their names were forgotten. But while money was scarce, social divisions were not. In fact, on those very same construction grounds, 3 very different classes of society brushed shoulders, and the contrasts between them were as sharp as stone edges. 3 classes, standing on the same ground, yet living in entirely different worlds. That was the strange reality of the 19th century pyramid sites. At the very bottom were the laborers, men with cracked hands and tired eyes, whose bodies carried the stones and whose sweat darkened the earth. Above them were the overseers and engineers, dressed in clean shirts and boots, holding clipboards instead of chisels, their words carrying more weight than the heaviest block. And then, there were the nobles and curious elites, ladies with parasols, gentlemen in top hats, who arrived in carriages just to marvel at the spectacle, sipping wine while the dust of toil swirled around them. I can almost see the scene, a worker wiping sweat from his brow, glancing up at a balcony where silk gowns shimmered in the sunlight. Did he feel invisible, or did he feel resentment? Personally, I think it must have been a mix of both. There's a quiet pain in knowing your back is breaking for someone else's glory. And yet, perhaps, a secret pride that without you, the grand show would crumble. This clash of classes wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It reminded everyone that the pyramid wasn't merely a monument of stone, but also a monument to inequality. And yet, within that inequality, there was interaction. A noble child leaning over the rail to watch the men work. A foreman barking orders. A laborer pretending not to notice the stairs. These brief, awkward meetings told a story of a society layered like the very stones they stacked: foundation, middle, and crown. And here's where it becomes even more fascinating. Despite their struggles, the workers were not ignorant of the secrets around them. They knew tricks of the trade, hidden methods, and clever techniques that the nobles could never imagine. Which leads us into the next part, the 7 building secrets that turned sweat and stone into wonders. 7 secrets hidden in stone. That's what made these 19th century pyramids possible. On the surface, they looked like massive blocks stacked by brute strength alone. But behind the scenes lay clever tricks that blended sweat with surprising ingenuity. Workers used giant wooden rollers to move stones across the ground, greasing them with animal fat so the blocks slid smoother than you'd expect. Steam-powered cranes, a marvel of the era, lifted weights that no human arm could manage. And when the machines broke down, ropes and pulleys, arranged in ways only seasoned laborers understood, took over with almost magical efficiency. I like to imagine a group of men at dusk, huddled together, whispering about a new shortcut they had discovered, how to chip the edges of a block so it locked perfectly with its neighbor, or how to sprinkle sand just right beneath a sled to reduce friction. These weren't just brute workers, they were craftsmen with knowledge passed quietly from hand to hand. Never written in books, but alive in calluses and intuition. Some of the secrets bordered on artistry. Decorative stonework was often carved on the ground, then hoisted into place with breathtaking precision, as if the pyramid itself had been stitched together by invisible threads. Even the way they arranged scaffolding revealed a kind of genius, building entire wooden skeletons around the monument so men could climb like ants over a hill of stone. To me, what's most moving is that these secrets weren't inventions of nobles or engineers alone. They belonged to the workers, their creativity, their problem-solving, their refusal to be defeated by stone or heat. And though the pyramids they built were artificial, the ingenuity was as real as the sweat dripping down their backs. But here's the most surprising twist. All of this labor, all of these hidden techniques, didn't simply vanish into the dust of time. What they created left behind more than stone. It left a legacy that still shapes how we imagine the past today. And that brings us to the final part, the single, enduring heritage of these forgotten builders. One legacy. That's what remains when all the sweat has dried and the workers' names have been lost to time. The artificial pyramids of the 19th century were not tombs for kings. But they became monuments all the same. They stood in the middle of world fairs, parks, and exhibitions, drawing gasps from visitors who had never set foot in Egypt yet suddenly felt connected to something ancient and eternal. What began as a job for survival turned into a symbol of culture, imagination, and human ambition. I often think about this transformation. A laborer might have seen only the dust clinging to his skin, the aching muscles, the coins barely enough to buy bread. Yet the same stones he lifted were later admired by crowds who saw mystery, power, and beauty. Isn't it extraordinary how the same object can hold two truths at once, suffering for the builder, wonder for the viewer? Personally, I feel that this duality is what makes these pyramids so moving. They remind us that even the harshest struggles can leave behind something that inspires generations. Today, we may stroll past a surviving structure or see a photograph in an old book without ever thinking of the men who built it. But if you look closer, you realize their legacy is not just stone, it's the idea that human effort, no matter how humble, can create symbols that outlive us all. In that sense, every bead of sweat became part of a story larger than any single life. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying with us. History is not only about kings and monuments, but about ordinary people who turned their exhaustion into culture. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for walking in their footsteps. And if you want to keep uncovering hidden lives from the past, give this video a like, subscribe, and share. It's your way of keeping their story alive.